JavaScript is something that you might feel that you've reviewed before, but it's a good idea to pay attention to this video and make sure that you learn all the new features we're going to be talking about that were introduced in ES6. So really quick, let's just start with data types. So JavaScript is fairly similar, has similar data types as other programming languages that you're probably familiar with. We have strings, numbers, booleans, symbols, null, undefined, and everything else is an object in JavaScript. So just a couple things to note: we don't have integers and floats. We just have number, and also null and undefined are actually separate primitives. And then that everything else is an object. And you can use the type of operator, which is shown here, to return whatever the type of any given variable is, and it'll return it as a string. So that can be useful sometimes, just to check that you're getting what you're expecting to be getting. Now let's talk a little bit about objects. So this is really the fundamental building block of everything in JavaScript. We have our two ways to declare them. This is my first preferred way here, where it's just a literal declaration as opposed to using a constructor. You don't see this too often. We have two different ways of accessing attributes on our objects. We can use dot notation as such, and we can also use bracket notation, which uses these brackets. And an important thing to note is that anything inside of these brackets will actually be evaluated as JavaScript. So here we've literally passed in the string name, but we could have actually passed in another variable, say like my attribute, which evaluates to the property string name, and then that would also work. So that's kind of something to note if you need to be able to dynamically index into an object. This bracket notation can be extremely helpful. And it's important to realize really objects are just kind of hash maps, key value stores. So they're really simple, and you can store almost anything in an object, including a function. So here we have an example of a student object, which I use the literal declaration here, and then we have the name attribute, and we also have the sayName function. And so I can actually say student.sayName, and it'll call this function, and inside the function I have the access to the this object, which is the current object in the scope of that block of code. So this.name is actually going to refer to Andre here. So that should be pretty intuitive. Variables, an important thing to realize, JavaScript is similar to Python in that it's loosely typed, or a dynamic language, meaning that you don't specify a type when initializing a variable. So in Java you say, string my string equals Andre. Here we can just say let string equal Andre, or like let my string equal Andre. So here we have a couple examples. We have this variable a, and we've set it to first be a string, and now a number, and now a boolean. And JavaScript doesn't care. Everything's pretty loosey-goosey. Now you should have noticed so far we've been using this let. If you are familiar with JavaScript pre-ES6, you might not be familiar with let. And let is basically the replacement to var. Var isn't really used, or shouldn't really be used much anymore. That's kind of dated code. But let is just how we declare a variable. So whenever we're declaring a variable in JavaScript, we have to start it with let. That tells JavaScript explicitly that we want to create a variable. And let is a mutable variable, so this works like just any type of variable you might expect. And its good friend is const. Now const is actually what I would encourage you guys to use more often than not. It's basically the exact same thing as let, except it's immutable, which means after it's been assigned once, it can no longer be altered. So here we see if we were to try to say my variable equals 20 after it was already assigned to 10, you're going to get a type error from the JavaScript engine. And it's a little bit faster, it's a little bit more efficient with the new V8 engine, which is what Chrome uses, and anything that uses Chromium is also using that V8 engine. Node as well uses a version of that V8 engine. And it also just is better programming practice. If you declare something as const, it's because you're not expecting it to change. And so it's a good idea that if later on in your code you try to modify something that you originally didn't want to be changed, the JavaScript engine will yell at you to remind you. So most of the time you use const, and if you need a situation where you need to modify a variable, you use let. An important thing to note here is that although we can't modify what my variable is pointing to. If this was an object, we would have no problem with assigning new attributes or modifying attributes to that object because we're not changing the reference that the variable is pointing to. We're just modifying the object at that reference. So this is again a good example. If you declare an object with const, it means that you don't want that reference to change, but you'll still be able to modify anything inside that object. All right. Undefined versus null. So undefined is what the default value of any variable is. If you don't assign a value to a variable, it's going to be undefined. So you see here we have let a. So a right now is undefined because we haven't explicitly told JavaScript what a is going to be. Now we give it the value hey, and now it is null. Now one thing that you should always keep in your mind is that you should never set a variable explicitly to undefined because JavaScript developers understand undefined as the default that JavaScript, the engine, assigns to variables. And so once you start assigning things to undefined, things get very confusing for other developers who have to use your code because they don't expect other developers to be assigning things to undefined. And if you are in a situation where you feel you need to, you should use null instead. Null is what you use when you've declared something and you want to intentionally leave it blank. It means no data. So again, you should never set a variable to undefined explicitly. You should never write my variable equals undefined. All right, let's keep going. So let's do a little pop quiz here. So what do you think would happen when we execute this code? So we've created an object explicitly, and then we've tried to index into the object with the attribute name, myObject.name. Take a second and think about it. The right answer is that it's going to come back as undefined because the default value for anything in JavaScript is undefined, and because the name attribute hasn't been defined on this myObject, the value for myObject.name is going to be undefined. Now this is a really, really useful and important thing to keep in mind because once we start using APIs and you're getting objects from your API on your front end and you want to use that, you can check does myObject dot, whatever key I'm looking for, and then that you can use to see if some field has been set or whether it exists or not. Same thing on the back end, you can also use it in the same way. So this is very common to check to see if something has been set. Okay, now do a little bit more on this pop quiz. What do we think is going to happen here? So we've created object A with the attribute name and object B with the attribute name and set them both equal to Joe. So if we run this code down here, if object A equals object B, return true, else return false, what do you think is going to happen? Take a second, think about it. You can always pause the video if you need a little bit more time. The answer is that this is going to be false. And the reason is because we've created two distinct objects here, right? And so even though they have the same attributes inside, it's literally two different object references, and that's why this is going to evaluate to false. Let's see this again in a different example. Take a second, think about it. Now, based on what I said last time, you should probably have guessed that this should return true because we have one object reference that we're evaluating, and that's why it's true. It's quite literally the exact same object. What? Anyways, something to take a second here, a small divergence. There is a difference between JSON and JavaScript objects. You've probably heard of JSON before. It's a really standard notation way of sharing data between APIs and things like that. And basically, JSON is a more strict version of JavaScript objects. And the reason is because all keys must be in double quotes, and the values can only be primitive data types, arrays, or other JSON objects. Whereas in JavaScript objects, when you declare them, keys don't have to be in double quotes, and also the values can be things like functions. So that's quite different. This isn't something that's like super important, but just important to keep in the back of your mind. Here we'll see like an example. This is a JavaScript object, right? So notice that the keys are not in quotes, and also we can have things like functions as values. Now if we look at a JSON object, you'll see that the keys are they're in double quotes, all of them, and we can't have we can't have functions as values. We can have other JSON objects as values, but we cannot have functions, and everything else has to be a primitive. Okay, JavaScript arrays. JavaScript arrays are super awesome, and there's going to be another video that kind of dives into this a little bit more in depth, but just for now, it's important to realize JavaScript arrays are similar to objects, and the way that you can think about it is all of the keys are just numbers from 0 to whatever. So JavaScript arrays, my bad, come with a lot of built-in functions that are very useful for developers. These I've kind of enumerated here: push, pop, unshift, shift, slice, splice, map, for each, filter, reduce. Some of these should look pretty familiar from just other standard programming languages, but we'll dive into some of the more important ones in a separate video. And the cool thing is, because it has all these built-in things, you can use JavaScript arrays to act like queues or stacks or just like a regular array. They're very, very flexible, very useful. So while we're on the topic of functions, that is also a very important part of JavaScript development. Functions are really how we do everything, right? So here's an example of what a function looks like, and we see we have our name, and then I guess we're jumping ahead. It's important to use a good name. You don't want to name a function just a letter. That's going to make it really hard for future developers and even for yourself when you're going back. So don't do that. We have our parameters, and then we have our function body logic. So this is just anything that your function is doing. Good programming practice, kind of on a tangent here, you really want to make your functions just do one thing and do that one thing well. A good rule of thumb is that if your function is starting to grow more than 5 to 8 lines, you should probably think about breaking it into 2 functions. If you're writing really good, clean code, most of your functions should probably be about 5 lines or so. And then finally we have our return. So this is a pretty standard way of noting a function. If you're familiar with other programming languages, this shouldn't be a stretch of the mind. So here's an example of just using a function, right? We've declared this add function, and then we're calling the add function with the parameters 1 and 2, and it's going to put that into here. A will be 1, B will be 2, return value will be A plus B, which will be 3, which we're storing in this const. Note that we're using a const, not let. And then we're going to console.log. Counseling.log is how you print things to your console. It's basically just the print statement for JavaScript. Now ES6 added really cool functionality called arrow functions. These are my favorite. When I'm developing, I hardly ever use function declarations like this. I always use arrow functions when I can. There's a couple different reasons why. Mostly it's just shorter. It's easier to write for the most part. It also lets us do some really cool things like having implicit returns and destructuring parameters. So again, if we look at the implicit returns, this is some examples here. So we have this array.forEach. So this is just going to iterate over everything. With a function declaration, the old style, we would have to write it out like this, and this takes up 3 lines of code, and there's a lot of just extra stuff, function, e, and then having the curly brackets and all this extra room. And so with the new style, we can pass it in such like this, just r.forEach, e is the parameter, and then we're using the parameter in the console.log, and this is an implicit return here, which is why we don't have any curly brackets. You can also have curly brackets and have an explicit return with arrow functions, but in this example, we don't really care about what is being returned, and so this is fine. Here's another really good example of using a arrow function as well as a map function from the array object. And so you see again function e, return e.age, and then here we have our implicit return more explicit. So here we had to say return e.age, and here we can just say e.age, and because this is just one statement and there are no curly brackets, this is treated as an implicit return. Alright, truthiness. We're getting close to the end, guys. Good job. So truthiness is essentially every variable in JavaScript is either truthy or falsy. It's a little separate from saying that something is true or false. Those are primitives, booleans, right? But rather, truthiness is just every variable can be evaluated to be either truthy or falsy. And the easiest way to learn this is just to learn what is falsy and realize that everything else is truthy. So there's just this short list of things that are falsy. So of course, the Boolean value false is falsy, 0, the number, an empty string, null, undefined, and not a number. NaN is not a number. Everything else will be truthy. So let's do this little pop quiz here. You should take a second, pause this video, and go through and write down somewhere or in your mind, go through what the truthiness for all of these things are. All right, now here are the answers. Anything surprising? Maybe note that an empty array and an empty object are both truthy. -1 is truthy. Everything else is probably pretty intuitive. True, false strings are strings, and strings that aren't empty are always truthy. Our ternary operator. So this is another cool JavaScript shorthand that I use a lot, and I encourage you to when applicable. And it's basically a way to condense an if statement. This is something that's pretty common in other languages as well, so you might be familiar with this. But if you consider it, it's broken down pretty simply. We have our condition, and if the condition is truthy, we're going to do this, right? Else, we're going to do this other thing. And so that can be condensed down to one line of code. Condition, question mark, truthy like action to take, or falsy action to take. Another thing that's really cool about conditionals that isn't really highlighted here is that they actually return either this value or this value. So very often when I use this, it's in assigning a new variable. So I might say, let role equals user.role equal admin, then the question mark true, false. And so then that'll store in my variable whether or not that user is an admin. So that's an example. You can ask the TAs around if you have any other questions about the ternary operator. You should also realize that there's actually two ways to evaluate for equality in JavaScript. We have our triple equals and our double equals. The short and sweet of this is that you should always use the triple equals. And the reason is because the triple equals evaluates for type as well as value, whereas the double equals does not evaluate for type. So sometimes you can have some very weird some weird logic issues if you're using the double equals in situations where you're not expecting something might return truthy that should be false or that you were expecting to be false. You can Google around a little bit if you want to learn more about this, but the short, I just recommend that you always use the triple equals. It's just always easier, it's cleaner, it's more explicit. And the same thing goes for not equals. It's going to be an exclamation mark and then 2 equal signs as opposed to just 1 equal sign. Cool. Destructuring is another ES6 thing that they added. This is also a really nice way. I think the easiest way is just looking at this example. This is an old style of doing stuff, right? So we have an object that has a name, age, and school. And in older versions of JavaScript, if I wanted to assign object.name to something, I would have to literally say const name. Actually, in an old JavaScript, it'd be var name is equal to ob.name. And that's just very explicit. If you have to do this for a lot of attributes, you're going to have a lot of code. So the new way of doing it is very clean, and it's just called object destructuring. And here you can see that we have on the right side of the equal sign the object, and then on the left side we have curly brackets, and inside the curly brackets are the names of the attributes that we're trying to destructure out of the object. So name and age are literally going to be pulled out of this object, and they're going to be created as new variables. So it's essentially the exact same effect as these two lines of code in this one line of code. And so you can see if we console.log name here, we'll get Joe. All right, there's some boxes. All right, guys, that's it. That's the crash course in JavaScript that you guys needed to get ready for this. If you have any other questions, let me know, and we will go from here.